Welcome to Quiz Time. I'm your Quizmaster, Sean, and I've got 100 questions for you about board games. So let's see what we remember and what we know, and let's have some fun reminiscing about playing board games. Unless you still play board games. Anyway, question 1. Which classic board game, launched in 1963, features players guessing the identities of hidden characters using a process of elimination? Clue, Guess Who, or Battleship? And the answer is Guess Who. What famous card game from the early 1900s involves making sets and runs to reach 0 points? Canasta, Rummy, or Gin? And that card game is Rummy. What board game from ancient China involves trapping opponents by surrounding their pieces? Go, chess, or reversi? And that Chinese game is Go. Which classic word game, released in 1948, challenges players to form words for points based on letter value? Scrabble, Boggle, or Upwards? And that classic game would be Scrabble. Which 17th century French card game features trick-taking, a unique trump suit, and a contract determined during bidding? Bridge, Pinochle, or Hearts? And that would be Bridge. Contract Bridge. What puzzle game, invented in 1974, involves aligning colored squares on a cube's sides? Rubik's Cube, Tetris, or Sudoku? And that would be Rubik's Cube. Introduced in 1957, which board game simulates naval warfare with players guessing fleet locations on a grid? Risk, Battleship, or Stratego? And that game would be Battleship. You sunk my battleship. What 19th century card game uses a 24-card deck where players try to win tricks by declaring a trump suit? Euchre, Poker, or Cribbage? And that game would be Euchre. Which tile-based game, originating from China and often played with 4 players, involves creating a specific combination of tiles to win? Mahjong, Dominoes, or Pente? And that would be Mahjong. What Japanese puzzle has players filling a grid with numbers 1 to 9 in each row, column, and 3x3 section? Ken-Ken, Kakuro, or Sudoku? And the game is Sudoku. What medieval European strategy board game involves trapping the opponent's king on the board? Checkers, chess, or Go? And of course, that game is chess. What card game, introduced in 1993, involves players building decks around creatures, spells, and lands to defeat opponents? Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, or Yu-Gi-Oh? And that game would be Magic the Gathering. What classic board game, dating back to the early 1900s, depicts life milestones like marriage and career? The Game of Life, Payday, or Careers? And that would be The Game of Life. Invented in 1972, which fast-paced word game has players racing to find words from random letter cubes against a clock? Scrabble, Boggle, or Upwards? And that game is Boggle. Released in 1995, which German-style board game involves trading, building, and expanding on a hexagonal board? Catan, Ticket to Ride, or Cassone? And that would be Catan. In what ancient two-player game do players flip opponents' pieces to capture more territory on the board? Othello, Mancala, or Reversi? And that game would be Reversi. What card game involves players matching colors, numbers, or symbols and shouting a keyword to win? Uno, Phase 10, or Crazy Eights? And that would be Uno. Which 2018 cooperative card game challenges players to climb a mountain by playing cards in ascending order without talking? The Crew, The Mind, or Hanabi? And that game would be The Mind. What classic puzzle game, named after a Russian mathematician, involves arranging falling shapes to complete lines and clear the board? Tetris, Bejeweled, or Columns? And that would be Tetris. In what puzzle do players avoid crossing lines when connecting points on a number grid? Hashi Wakakero, Slitherlink, or Ken-Ken? And that game would be Slitherlink. Invented in 18th century England, what card game asks players to pair cards to reach 15 points? Cribbage, Whist, or Rummy? And that game invented in England is Cribbage. Don't forget knobs. Always include knobs. Which puzzle-based board game, released in 1974, features a detective solving a murder by determining the suspect, weapon, and location? Clue, Risk, or Mastermind? And that would be the game Clue. It was Professor Plum in the library with a wrench. What two-player game, created in 1970, involves guessing the color and sequence of a hidden code through logical deduction? Mastermind, Stratego, or Battleship? And that would be Mastermind. Which classic board game, designed to teach capitalism, involves buying and developing properties to bankrupt opponents? Monopoly, The Game of Life, or Payday? And that board game is Monopoly. Which card game, originally in 1971, allows players to capture and control planets using themed deck cards? Cosmic Encounter, Magic the Gathering, or Dominion? And that game is Cosmic Encounter. In which 1979 puzzle game did players arrange small colored pegs to form intricate patterns on a grid? Mastermind, Blowkiss, or Light Bright? And that would be a Light Bright. That was a game? Which fast-paced board game, introduced in 1994, involves flipping cards and making quick mathematical calculations under pressure? Set, 24 game, or Bananagrams? And that game would be 24 game. Which 2019 puzzle game has players create stained glass windows by drafting dice for color and pattern? Sagrada, Azul, or Reef? And that game would be Sagrada. Which tile laying game, released in 2000, challenges players to build medieval cities, roads, and farms for points? Carcassonne, Catan, or Dominion? And that game would be Carcassonne. In which card game, introduced in 1991, players place bets on which cards will score the highest to win the trick? Pinochle, whist, or spades? And that would be whist. Which board game, launched in 2002, asks players to act out, draw, or sculpt various challenges within a time limit? Cranium, Pictionary, or charades? And that game would be Cranium. Which puzzle game, first developed in 1995, requires players to create pictures by shading grid squares based on numeric clues? Nonograms, Sudoku, or Kakuro? And that game is Nonograms. Which card game, originally called Cheat, challenges players to bluff and lie while discarding their cards face down? I Doubt It, Old Maid, or War? And that would be I Doubt It. In which logic puzzle, invented in 1997, do players fit different shapes into a square grid without overlapping? Blocus, Tetris, or Pentaminos? That would be Pentaminos. Which game, first created in 1989, allows players to manage their resources in cities in an ancient Roman Empire setting? Puerto Rico, Tigris and Euphrates, or Dominion? And that game would be Puerto Rico. Introduced in 2019, which board game has players deciphering hieroglyphs, unlocking secrets, and solving riddles together? Unlock, The Search for Planet X, or The Seventh Continent? Unlock. Published in 2007, which strategy game lets players roleplay as medieval leaders expanding influence through conquering lands and developing resources? Dominant Species, Small World, or Race for the Galaxy? And that would be Small World. Which game, invented in the 1980s, has players place cards down while racing to and from consecutive number runs before others? Skip Bo, Phase 10, or Uno? Racing to form consecutive number runs before others. Okay, that would be Phase 10. Which card game, originally popularized in the Wild West, involves trying to win 5-card hands with betting and bluffing? Poker, blackjack, or pinochle? And that game would be poker. Which dice-based game, released in 1956, tasks players with creating different scoring combinations based on the roll of 5 dice? Yahtzee, Farkle, or Bunko? And that card game would be Yahtzee. Which abstract strategy game, dating back to the Viking era, involves moving pieces to trap a king on a square board? Chess, Go, or Hnefatafy? Hnefatafy, that's it. It's Hnefatafy. Which 2-player board game, first published in 1947, uses simple rules to control 4 armies and engage in tactical battle? Stratego, Risk, or Axis and Allies? And that game would be Stratego. In which word game, invented in 1978, do players race to connect letters in a grid to form as many words as possible? Boggle, Scrabble, or Upwards? And that would be Boggle. Which puzzle game, introduced in 1999, challenges players to place different animal-shaped pieces into a grid without leaving gaps? Zularetto, Patchwork, or Blocus? That's Blocus. Which puzzle game, invented in 1966, involves rotating three-dimensional shapes to form a continuous path or figure? Tetris, Soma Cube, or Pentaminos? And that would be Soma Cube. Which strategy board game, created in 1967, challenges players to connect 4 of their colored pieces in a straight line? Connect 4, Othello, or Reversi? And that would be Connect 4. Which puzzle game, launched in 1993, asks players to balance blocks while avoiding toppling the entire tower during each turn? Jenga, Blockus, or Uno Stacko? And that game is Jenga. Which quick-thinking word game from 1986 challenges players to describe a word without using specific forbidden clues? Scattergories, Balderdash, or Taboo? And that would be Taboo. Which pattern-matching board game, released in 1999, requires players to place tiles and form specific colored shapes for points? Azul, Hive, or Santorini? And that game would be Hive. Which puzzle game, developed in the 1980s, tasks players with rotating triangles to complete a circular pattern? Tantrix, Pentaminos, or Hex? And that game would be Tantrix. Which game, first published in 1998, simulates constructing the perfect zoo using different colored tiles and animal species? Zularetto, Catan, or Agricola? And the game is Zularetto. Which strategic two-player game, invented in 1967, involves arranging colored discs to create patterns and dominate the board? Reversi, Othello, or Go? And that game would be Othello. In which game, developed in 1994, do players bid on and collect different types of gemstones while managing resources? Splendor, Haipur, or Azul? And that game would be Splendor. Which puzzle game, launched in 1985, asks players to rotate cubes and match patterns to solve the puzzle before time runs out? Rubik's Race, Perplexus, or Soma Cube? That game would be Rubik's Race. Which 2014 puzzle board game challenges players to carefully stack colorful rings on a tree without causing imbalance? Topple, Arboretum, or Kodama? And that game is Arboretum. Which abstract board game, first released in 1989, involves rotating pieces on a hexagonal grid to trap and outmaneuver opponents? Abalone, Hive, or Quarto? Rotating piece on a hexagonal grid. That would be Hive. Which tile laying game from 2007 challenges players to form chains of the same symbol or color for points? Hive, Azul, or Quirkle? And that board game would be Quirkle. Which puzzle game, launched in 2001, asks players to rotate pieces to navigate a marble through an intricate maze? Perplexus, Rubik's Cube, or Rush Hour? And that game would be Perplexus. Which game, created in 1981, involves players launching small discs into pockets while avoiding fouls and penalties. Carom, crokinole, or table shuffleboard? And that game would be crokinole. Which game, introduced in 1990, requires players to maneuver trains across Europe and connect cities using rail cards? Ticket to Ride Europe, Transamerica, or Power Grid? And that would be Ticket to Ride Europe. Which game, first launched in 2014, lets players control factions competing for dominance in a steampunk alternate history? Sith, Eclipse, or Terra Mystica? And that would be Sith. Which two-player abstract game, created in 1980, features a circular board where players must align pieces of their color to win? Abalone, Pente, or Quarto? And that game would be Abalone. Which card-based role-playing game, popularized in the 2000s, involves players defeating monsters and collecting treasures to level up? Munchkin, Dungeons & Dragons, or Pathfinder? And that would be Munchkin. Which game, introduced in 2008, tasks players with managing workers and collecting goods to expand a farming operation? Agricola, Caverna, or Le Havre? And that would be Agricola. Which trivia game, launched in 1981, asks players to answer questions from 6 categories to earn wedges and win the game? Trivial Pursuit, Quizmaster, or Bezer Whizzer? And that would be Trivial Pursuit. Which two-player card game, first published in 2009, centers around asymmetrical factions competing to overthrow or defend a galactic empire? Star Wars the Card Game, Netrunner, or Android Netrunner? And that would be Android Netrunner. Which 1987 game challenges players to outmaneuver their opponents by capturing strategic outposts in a post-apocalyptic setting? Twilight Imperium, Risk 22 AD, or Car Wars? And that would be Risk 2210 AD. Which game, first introduced in 1972, involves managing hotel chains and merging them to create the most valuable empire? Acquire, Monopoly, or Power Grid? Acquire. Which strategy board game, published in 1996, simulates European political and economic dynamics from the 16th to 18th centuries? Diplomacy, Here I Stand, or Imperial? And that's Here I Stand. Which board game, created in 1998, features players managing railroad companies, laying tracks, and delivering goods across a network? Age of Steam, Power Grid, or Steam? And that would be Age of Steam. Which card game, launched in 2000, challenges players to balance acquiring cards with points and using action cards to hinder opponents? Dominion, Splendor, or Seven Wonders? And that would be Dominion. In which abstract strategy game, released in 2002, do players build structures using rods and connectors to score points? Tigris and Euphrates, Blocus, or Torres? And that would be Torres. Which game, first published in 2013, asks players to explore dungeons, collect treasures, and defeat monsters using dice and cards? Descent, Clank, or Dungeon Quest? And that game is Clank. Which puzzle game, created in 2007, involves rotating tiles to connect paths while preventing opponents from closing your routes? Tsuro, Labyrinth, or Quirkle? Tsuro. Which cooperative board game, first released in 2010, has players working together to find treasure on a sinking island? Forbidden Island, Robinson Crusoe, or Escape: The Curse of the Temple? Forbidden Island. Which card game, first introduced in 2005, revolves around competing chefs creating dishes and earning the highest number of stars? Food Chain Magnate, Sushi Go, or Bon Appetit? And that would be Sushi Go. Which board game, released in 2012, challenges players to settle Mars by developing colonies, controlling resources, and completing objectives? First Martians, Race for the Galaxy, or Terraforming Mars? And that game is Terraforming Mars. Which game, published in 1990, involves manipulating rows of colored tiles on a board to score points by matching patterns? Ingenious, Blocus, or Quirkle? Quirkle. Which deck-building game, released in 2008, involves players collecting and upgrading cards to create powerful combinations to win? Dominion, Ascension, or Legendary? And that would be Ascension. Which cooperative game, launched in 2013, asks players to control characters in a haunted mansion while solving puzzles to defeat monsters? Arkham Horror, Mansions of Madness, or Betrayal at House on the Hill? And that would be Mansions of Madness. Which board game, first released in 1979, involves buying and developing railroads while managing stocks and financial decisions? Power Grid, Transamerica, or 1830, Railways and Robber Barons? 1830, Railways and Robber Barons. Which abstract game, published in 2003, involves stacking pieces in different formations to complete puzzles on a three-dimensional grid? Cathedral, Rumis, or Hive? And that would be Rumis. Which card game, first introduced in 1994, involves building civilizations by playing cards representing resources, buildings, and armies? Seven Wonders, Puerto Rico, or Concordia? And that would be Seven Wonders. Which board game, first released in 2015, challenges players to move around a map, complete contact tracks, and manage cattle? Agricola, Stone Age, or Great Western Trail? That would be Great Western Trail. Which puzzle game, first launched in 1985, challenges players to remove sticks from a cylinder without letting marbles fall? Kerplunk, Jenga, or Perplexus? Kerplunk. Which game, created in 2008, tasks players with managing a post-apocalyptic wasteland while scavenging resources and battling raiders? Fallout the board game, Dead of Winter, Wasteland Express Delivery Service? Wasteland Express Delivery Service. Which card game, first released in 2011, asks players to solve mysteries using cards representing clues, suspects, and locations? Clue, Mysterium, or Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective? And that would be Mysterium. Which cooperative board game, launched in 2007, has players exploring and surviving on a mysterious island by gathering resources and building shelters? Pandemic, Robinson Crusoe, or Forbidden Island? And that would be Robinson Crusoe. Which 2010 card game requires players to cooperate to save endangered species by developing habitats and protecting animal populations? Evolution, Endangered, or Ark? And that would be Endangered. Which card game, released in 2016, has players drafting and upgrading cards to build and manage a vineyard? Viticulture, Seven Wonders, or Splendor? And that would be Viticulture. Which board game, first published in 2009, challenges players to manage a power company by bidding for resources and expanding their grid? Power Grid, Terra Mystica, or 1830? And that would be Power Grid. Which abstract strategy game, released in 2015, asks players to control animals and use their abilities to capture opponents' pieces? Hive, Onitama, or Tigris and Euphrates? And that would be Onitama. Which tile laying game, first introduced in 2008, asks players to build a kingdom using dominoes to claim and expand territories? Alhambra, Carcassonne, or King Domino? And that would be King Domino. Which board game, released in 1997, has players taking on the role of traders, collecting and delivering goods across the Mediterranean? Catan, Concordia, or Ticket to Ride? And that would be Concordia. Which card game, launched in 2009, challenges players to collect and manage ingredients to brew potions and defeat monsters? Potion Explosion, Quacks of Quedlinburg, or Harry Potter, Hogwarts Battle? That's Potion Explosion. What 2010 board game has players collaborate to survive in a post-apocalyptic world by gathering resources and completing objectives? Dead of Winter, Fallout, Wasteland Express, Delivery Service? And that's Dead of Winter. Which board game, introduced in 2013, involves players drafting dice to assign workers and complete tasks in a Renaissance city? Coimbra, Grand Austria Hotel, or The Voyages of Marco Polo? The Voyages of Marco Polo. In 2017, which deck-building game lets players compete as Renaissance merchants, acquiring gems and building routes to gain prestige? Splendor, Concordia, or Century, Spice Road? That's Century, Spice Road. Introduced in 2008, which cooperative board game has players defending Earth from alien invaders through battles and resource management? Pandemic, Space Alert, or XCOM, the board game? And that would be XCOM, the board game. Which board game, launched in 2002, challenges players to build the best medieval city by placing buildings, roads, and resources strategically? Carcassonne, Alhambra, or Keyflower? Alhambra. And that was question number 100. Thanks for playing Quiz Time. Drop your score in the comments, please, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss Quiz Time when it comes out. And we try to make a new one often. Thanks for playing. We'll catch you in the next one.